Welcome everyone to the Australian Centre on China and the World. My name is Ben Hillman. I'm the director of the centre, and I'd like to, on behalf of the centre and my colleagues at the ANU, acknowledge that we're meeting here today on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, and we pay our respect to their elders, past and present. I also extend our respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining us today. It's my great pleasure to welcome such a preeminent China historian to our seminar series today, John Fitzgerald, who's Emeritus Professor at Swinburne University of Technology and who has worked in a number of extraordinary posts prior to his appointment at Swinburne, including the lead representative of Ford Foundation in Beijing, which was a 5-year term till 2013. And before that, John was head of the School of Social Sciences at La Trobe, and prior to that was the director of the International Centre of Excellence here at International Centre of Excellence in Asia Pacific Studies here at the Australian National University. John's also served as chair of the Education Committee of the Australia-China Council at the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, and was also International Secretary of the Australian Academy of the Humanities and President of the Australian Academy of the Humanities from 2015 to 2017. So John's going to be talking us today about his fantastic book, Cadre Country or Cadre Country, and with some updated reflections on the book. And so it's a great privilege and an honour to welcome you here today, John, and we very much look forward to the discussion. We have about 90 minutes. John's going to talk for 50 minutes or so, and then we'll have 30 or 40 minutes for discussion. The seminar today is being recorded and will be available online for people who couldn't join us today. So could I please remind you, if you haven't done so already, to turn off your mobile phones. Thanks, and please join me in welcoming Professor John Fitzgerald.
Thank you, Ben, and Nancy, for setting up this meeting. This, I believe, is National Reconciliation Week, so special appreciation and recognition of the Ngunnawal people of whose land we speak and meet. The book Cadre Country came out in 2022, so it's a couple of years on now. But that said, a couple of other very interesting books came out that year as well. I'd just like to touch on those briefly before I begin. One is Zhou Xueguang's The Logic of Governance in China, and the other is Xi Jinping's Origins of China's Institutions and Totalitarianism. Just coincidentally, they happen to converge around this idea of what is this institution that is China? What is it about the Chinese Communist Party that's special? And how is it that China's history and institutional legacy relates to contemporary China? Each of these authors takes a slightly different view, but I'd just like to pay my respects to them as well. I think they've done some quite extraordinary research, yielding really important insights in the institutional history of the modern Chinese state. I guess where Cadre Country is a little bit different is that it's not just about how the structure works. It tries to explain why it works to keep ordinary people out, and the constitutional issue of who may or may not participate in politics in China is at the heart of the book. And this goes to a late Qing debate, which has been covered in other sources. I won't mention it here. So the book differs from them a little bit in not being so technical and not being quite so concerned with the way the system works and its flexibility, adaptability, and local and central, though I touch on that as well. It's really more about how this system operates to exclude people from participation. So look, there's quite a bit of attention to this distinction between insiders and outsiders, tijuneideren and tijuwaideren. That's perhaps drawn a little too clearly. It's not quite like that in everyday life. Nevertheless, conceptually, it's a very significant distinction, and I think it's worth bearing or drawing out, because generally people outside China are aware of it. And part of the reason for writing this book was to bring an Australian community, also Australian public officials, up to date on what's happening in China not in international relations, not in geopolitics, just inside China, and what this might mean for interpreting China's geopolitics, international relations, different strategies, and so on. So it's really not directed at an international audience. It's really focused. It's illustrations. Many of the authors I cite are Australians, and many of the illustrations are drawn from here in Australia. Now, today what I'd like to talk about, and I'll elaborate a little bit further than I do, and in fact bring up today, is this question of nationalism and what it means in China. And to provide just a little bit more theoretical insight than I do here in this book, which is really written for a general audience. So the book's about several things, including nationalism, or rather the merger of nationalism with Leninism to yield this subspecies of modern Chinese nationalism I call Chinese Communist Party nationalism, CCP nationalism. That's what I want to touch on, draw out here. It's a smaller subset of the larger set of Chinese nationalism. As we know, China's emergence, in recent decades as a great power, has contributed to a rise in popular nationalism, driven in part by pride in the country's achievements, partly by a widespread public perception that countries in the West are unwilling to accept China as their equal. The debate or argue those, they're the perceptions. Opinion polling suggests this kind of popular nationalism supports the Communist Party of China at home and in its relations with the world. So the country's re-emergence as a great power also has implications for the party's own legitimacy, for the party's self-esteem, for the party's status in China, and its place on the rolling horizon of China's history, which is where it locates itself invariably in current conversations. And I think this is important, that nationalism in China has an international and a domestic aspect about the party, because while the party can be confident popular patriotism is trending in its favour, its own self-confidence can never be taken for granted. And just dwell on this for a moment. Much hinges on the party's own confidence in its own mission, because its grip on China rests not on popular patriotism. This is not a popularity contest. It's not as if the government's unpopular and will step down. No way. It actually rests on faith within the party, in the Communist Party itself, and in its national mission. It rests on CCP nationalism. And that entails an act of faith. In CCP nationalism, in short, the party identifies itself as the sole legitimate representative of China's people. It confines the political nation, that is, those who participate in politics, to its own cadre force. It regards its mission as sacred, and it believes its party mission is the destiny that history has laid down for China. This all takes an act of faith. You don't believe it, it falls apart. And not just faith, of course. The party insists on retaining itself, ownership and command of all legitimate forms of violence. I refer here to the arms of the PLA, PAP, indirectly, control over the judicial and the justice system and the police force, so on. A monopoly over the legitimate use of violence is in fact the conventional definition of a national state, not a party. The CCP insists it's a party when I'd suggest it actually closely resembles a nation state within a nation governing its subject nation. So CCP nationalism is concerned with maintaining the party's identification with China and its status within China against all possible threats at home and abroad, no less than concern for the country's standing in the world. For a party whose relations with people, the state, and the country is one of identity, the slightest challenge to that claim on identity presents a national security threat. Not surprisingly, this leads to heightened vigilance and repression at home, most notably in Hong Kong. But it's increasingly an issue in the country's international relations. I'll come back to this at the end. For as China's global footprint expands, domestic regime security is increasingly tethered to national security. I think this is very clear in Xi Jinping's 总体国家安全 framework, comprehensive national security framework. The party's self-identification in its foreign with China's sovereignty and its people, in fact, its claim on sovereignty as a party, is increasingly a point of sensitivity in foreign relations. We know Xi Jinping time and again talking not only about the force self-confidence, the need for self-confidence in the party, but insisting no foreign country should drive a wedge between China's party and its people, several times in recent years. The party leadership allows no suggestion from within or without that it is not what it professes to be, China's de facto sovereign nation. Now that's important for any analysis of nationalism in China. CCP nationalism is a big topic. Chinese nationalism is bigger again. The book draws on history and theory to make sense of nationalism more broadly as an historical phenomenon and to try and place CCP nationalism in that larger canvas of nationalism in China. For theory, I draw lightly in the book, but I'll do a bit more heavily here, on Leah Greenfeld's work on nationalism, and also on Philip Selznick's understanding of communist parties or Leninism. Leah Greenfeld, in particular, focuses on the emergence and impact of nationalism as an idea and as a phenomenon globally, and by focusing on the values, she says, are associated with it. These values, and let me say clearly here, are equality and popular sovereignty. These are not Marxist or communist values, they're nationalist values. The spread of nationalism, historically, is accompanied this with the spread of the idea of equality, not just among nations, but within nations and among citizens. Similarly, with the idea that citizens govern or popular sovereignty, and there's barely a state in the present world that doesn't make a claim one way or another, both equality and sovereignty. So what's this got to do with Marxism? Well, curiously, Marxism and nationalism are very close bedfellows. In theory, this shouldn't be the case. For Marxism is a doctrine of socialist revolution associated with the dissolution of nations and the promise of creating a universal, equal, self-governing communist society. But the vector linking Marxism and nationalism, each of them laying claim to sovereignty, to equality and popular sovereignty. The vector linking them is the Communist Leninist vanguard party. Leninism is a national articulation, as Selznick describes it, of the universal Marxist ideal, an organizational weapon cultivating an insulated elite of managers or cadres to seize, exercise, and retain state power at the national level in the name of communism. So Leninism, again to Selznick, cultivates intense loyalty to the party among its members, along with a kind of national institutional patriotism towards the party and its organization. And it breeds a kind of counterpointing patriotic hatred, party hatred towards its presumptive enemies. Map this onto a national state, and you have a very, very virulent form of party nationalism. So the historical moment of arrival comes when a Leninist party seizes national state power and converges or maps itself onto a national state. At that point, institutional patriotism and loyalty towards the party maps directly onto state nationalism. That is, nationalism directed around and toward a state model on the party itself. And at the heart of this kind of CCP nationalism is the idea that the party then can ally with the people for political life, because it is, or at least represents, the nation. It is sovereign. So much for theory. The focus of the book is what it is that makes Xi Jinping's China different, not just different from the Reform era, from the Republic, but also different from imperial China, going back ways. I write about difference in a contrarian mode to counter those who, at the time I started writing, who would claim that Xi Jinping's China is a riff of China's glorious imperial past, or that it's becoming just like us, which is also a very common refrain here in Australia. Sat down to write, we no longer hear it, but that was the constant refrain of those who wanted to explain China to the rural Australian population. But also to counter the claim that the PRC is just one more instance of efficient authoritarian East Asian state, say like Taiwan under Chiang Kai-shek, or South Korea under President Park Chung-hee, playing development catch-up, you might say, with the intervention of an authoritarian government. As Steinringen pointed out in his book, which I think captures, is the best term to describe contemporary China, the perfect dictatorship. China is not like South Korea or Taiwan or Japan. Quote, the party state is like no other state. The socialist market economy, like no other economy. China is different. He sets out to explain why in his book. It's quite a persuasive book. As I put it in the book, looking at China under Xi Jinping, China is not just and also ran among the world's authoritarian regimes, but a party state of unprecedented size, engaged in the attempt to consume the relatively liberal society and economy over which it came to preside following 3 decades of opening reform. You'd all be familiar with that. It was a very different China, I would argue. A very different future for China was in prospect in the reform era. Well, the Communist Party today has decided to claim all of those achievements of reform and opening for itself, and then double down on its historical mission and sticking to its original intentions, which was in one of those favourite expressions. CCP nationalism, that is Marxist-Leninist nationalism, is here to stay. It's not going to budge. And the party's honest about this. It insists it's not following the East Asian authoritarian model, but instead adhering to its original intentions, as a Leninist vanguard party should, to ensure that China retains sovereignty. Now, the argument in China among intellectuals supporting this position, often associated with the party, is that South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan all turned liberal democratic. In the process, they surrendered their sovereignty. In what sense? The authoritarian party is sovereign once it surrenders sovereignty through what? Constitutional government, through equal citizenship, civic freedom, electoral accountability. Do that, you lose sovereignty. Why? Because the party itself is sovereign. China would lose sovereignty if the party does. So the party sees itself as the site of sovereignty, and its cadres, I argue, is making up the political nation, known as cadre nation. The book starts out explaining what cadres are and how this cadre system works, how it came about, how it operates, and so on, without getting lost in technical detail. Basically, it starts out as a word borrowed from Japanese to apply to military officers in the Kuomintang, military forces in the early Republic. It's after Lenin's representatives visit China in the early 1920s, that it transitions to a position in the line of command in a civil structure. But the line of command is a Leninist party structure, very similar to a military one. It's about command. A gunbu is an official whose role is determined by their function in the matrix, responsive to those above, not responsive to anything outside the matrix. Now, there's the traditional, tiao tiao, quai quai problem. That's within the matrix. I'm suggesting here, China's not just the matrix. It isn't just the party. There's a whole lot outside it. There's no reason for anyone in the matrix to take account of anyone's opinion, whatever, at the local level. Now, that's research has told us now for decades that, in fact, in villages and counties, you often do find cadres who are working diligently for their own people and advancing their interests by resisting central control. That's not the party work, that's not the system working the way it should. That's communities surviving despite the system, describing the system. CCP nationalism is founded on the assumption that it is the matrix that constitutes the nation and the state. And it's all about hierarchy, not equality. So what emerges from my brief survey here is that China's cadre system is different from a civil service, like we might know in a constitutional democracy, Its highest priority is loyalty, loyalty to those above it, to its leadership and to its patrons. Its key posts are filled through the party organisation department. You all know this. So when you hear in China people complaining about bureaucracy, they don't just complain about pen pushes and so much red tape. They also complain about privilege or inequality. In fact, during my time in China, both from the 70s right the way through, people have complained about cadres. On the whole, it's about the unequal distribution of rights between cadres and themselves, or privileges between cadres and themselves. I'd suggest that, in fact, this is probably stepping over the mark, but the major moves towards democratic reform in China have been driven not by demands for freedom, but by demands for equality between citizens and the Leninist party state. I'm thinking of Wei Jingsheng, who used the word freedom, but most of his complaints were about how damned unequal it is, how hard it is for poor people to get by when the cadres are just eating all their rice and so on. It's the inequality structured into the system that drives his argument for democratic reform, not a demand for freedom. And I think if we look at the 1989 demonstrations, whose anniversary falls tomorrow, there's a very, very similar refrain running through there about corruption and inequality, only marginally, really. I shouldn't say that, because I'm not interested in this. Freedom features, but it's not the main driver. In the book, I spend several chapters trying to explain how people are kept in their place. Now, we all know about the hukou system, how that works. I don't spend a lot of time on that. But I think conceptually, ideologically, people are kept in their place as well. So I spent some time looking at naming practices, how it is that places come to be named what they are, people are assigned to them, in what sense they make them. So an early chapter called Who Owns China is devoted to these naming and language practices which put people in their place, showing, for example, how the word Zhongguo, which we normally translate as China, is owned not by the people of China, by the party and the party structure. None but the party government, the party and its government and military arms and affiliated agencies can use the word Zhongguo in their title or in their promotions in any domain. In this sense, the party owns China, Zhongguo, and stops common people from using the name of the country, say in branding a private business firm, or civic organisation, or a club. So the party excludes ordinary people from participating. This is one manifestation of that participation. But it's not just China, it applies at every level of the matrix. So if you live in Shanghai or Hunan, as an ordinary citizen, you cannot, as a rule, name a club, society, whatever, after the place you live in. Basically, that's a party's name, privilege. There's some variation on this, particularly in the reform era, but when the system works well, that's how it's supposed to work. There are many other ways the party keeps common people in their place. And again, I'm referring not just to the hukou system, but figuratively as well, where the Communist Party presumes to act in place of common people in governing them. There's a quasi-constitutional rationale for all this, to distinguish those who govern from the people who are subjects, who are governed and administered. And this rationale is embedded in the party constitution, various points, in the party organisation, and in the privileged way of life that cadres and families enjoy within the organisational matrix. The book asks also, is there a deeper constitutional rationale for this kind of order which excludes ordinary people from participation? Is there a constitutional rationale for a different kind of order? So I refute the idea that the People's Republic of China is the old empire reborn for the modern age. And I think you'll find in the two books I mentioned at the outset, Zhou Xueguang's, Chen Guang's, both make this claim that China is not just the reinvention of an old imperial past. It is a hugely different structure, which owes most of its institutional heft to the Soviet Union, grafted on to some kind of legacy, which enabled the state to expand its reach and control beyond anything can ever imagine. In the book, I argue that another way in which the party keeps people in their place is that it retained core features of an old constitutional compact, the old imperial, which separated state and society and yet gave society, local society, enormous leeway in managing itself. It builds on that old constitutional compact, separating the state and society, or the administrative from the social, but alters the balance by doing away with society completely, organized society, eliminating patriarchal lineages and their organizations in total, and today preventing the re-emergence of anything that could be considered an independent, organized society. In place of the organized society they destroyed and continued to prevent re-emerging, they created a system of local party mass organizations where the people, the renmin, live and work at village and township and urban district level, or collective and community. So in this way, the party state relates to its own simulacrum of society, structured as a collective people, rather than to any kind of society outside its own matrix. Now, the people are not technically part of the state, so the separation between state and society still holds principle, as it did under the old constitutional compact. But it's now transferred to relations between the state and collective units within the party-state matrix, which allows no freedom of movement, no equality, in fact, between social organisation and party-state organisation. In exploring these questions of constitutional order, I go back to 18th and 19th and early 20th century constitutional thinkers and their aspirations. For looking to their aspirations for civic equality and popular sovereignty and how they thought and what they proposed and how it matches up against this contemporary Communist Party nationalism. Now, some, particularly political scientists, dismiss this sort of approach, which goes back to what constitutional thinkers were thinking in the late Qing. But in fact, I think that's misplaced because Xi Jinping and his administrators are themselves now going back and ransacking the classics and quoting them at length in their treatises on public administration and party management. Xi Jinping himself, in his speeches, whether it's yours or not, I don't know, but he quotes long-dead imperial officials and scholars on the subject of bureaucracy, its risks, and how it should work. And this, I would argue, is because he's encountering similar problems to those that beset the imperial bureaucracy around corruption, loyalty, and obedience to higher authority, all of which were features of that, although, as I said, there was society that stood outside the state. The final chapters of Cadre Country then focus on these institutional continuities and discontinuities in bureaucratic management of what is a vast territorial state. I think what's, again, the other two books of mine try to bring home is it's impossible to understand China, contemporary China, without understanding it is a vast territorial state that needs to be administered. So the question of how to administer, whether to enable local participation in that administration, is the critical constitutional issue. But one can never forget that it is a vast territorial state and a huge management challenge for any government, whatever the constitutional arrangement might be. Cadre Country also tells the story of intergenerational strategies of elite families, new and old, from empire to republic. All of them trying to ensure they retain their own status as families through family strategies, and at the same time preserve the status of the party, which is the foundation of their status, and at the same time preserve the status of China as a unified territorial state, which gives the party the resources that can be shared with families which dominate. I include a chapter on families, and in fact, the increasingly popular historical narrative of the party as one big family. Often people point out, Xi Jinping invariably says, Xingda, Xingda. What that's saying is the party is Xing, it has a surname, it is a genealogy, it is a lineage. And you're in it or you're not. And if you're in it, you have to be loyal towards it. But the same is happening through the patriotic education campaign, where students are taught The country is a great big family. Jia, Guojia, Yang, so on. And this just wasn't the case until really the 1990s, post-Tiananmen patriotic education campaign. The idea that the family and the state are in a sense one and the same is not the case. And I try to argue, going back to classics, how the family was considered in relation to the state. I argue, in fact, the family was considered what modeled. The state is modeled on the family, but the family is a resource outside the state, which ensures the survival of Chinese culture and civilization despite the collapse of the state. And I think that's a very different argument from what's being argued now. The argument now is the family, the state is like a family, and if the state falls, families fall. It used to be kind of the reverse. If the state falls, families will survive, because China values families. Anyway, a complicated argument. I mean, read that if you want to take it up. But it does strike me this increasing focus on the family as a model for nation has echoes of Meiji era nationalism in Japan, in which the family and the emperor were seen to be one, and loyalty to the one was loyalty to the family is owed to the other. And we know where that went. It wasn't very happy. It wasn't a very happy outcome. These family and national narratives at the end of the day are about status. That goes to the question of equality, which is a fundamental nationalist value, as Lai Greenfield argues. Concern with status, competition, and equality lies at the heart of nationalism everywhere, in Lai Greenfield's argument. In the People's Republic, this concern is refracted through a lens of humiliation and pride, and further filtered through a very narrow aperture of tight party control over information and communications, where it's directed against former colonial European powers, the United States and Japan. Liu Xiaobo wrote extensively on this in relation to the patriotic education campaign. But the book returns, I'll leave that there for you. The book returns one way and another to the question of status, unequal status within contemporary China, partly to explain how the system works, but also to highlight some of the drivers pushing the current Xi administration away from the old agenda of opening and reform. That is, once again, elevating the party above all, crushing independent social organization, quashing the legal profession, corralling private capital, calling a halt to market opening and rule of law, and so on. These actions are designed, above all, to preserve the status of the party and its leadership, allowing everyone to participate in public life and politics within the end of the party, at least its standing in China. To argue that the greatest status barrier in China is the party, its bureaucracy itself. This begins with party membership, and the overall profile of party members is fairly representative. My point is rather that it's by becoming a member, one steps over the threshold to become an active civic citizen, part of the party nation. So the right to participate in political decision-making, as a disciplined member of the party that runs everything, is a key status differentiator in China, marked by membership. Within party and government ranks, again, status is further marked by cadres' place in the matrix. Up or down the many layers of territorial hierarchy, we're familiar with those, the 5 levels, by relations with patrons, in contrast to other patrons, and by revolutionary genealogies, again a question for family. That is how deep the red genes run in a family lineage. I elaborated this question of red genetic inheritance at some length. I won't do so here. Then there's the status barriers separating outsiders from insiders, whose status is ensured by their relations with the party and party state. As I said, insiders occupy places within the system. Franz Sherman called the organization. Reformers, I argue, were pressing hard to break some of those barriers between teaching A and teach Y. In the 1980s, again in the early 2000s, by pressing for reforms in the legal and judicial systems and the market economy, which would have that effect. These legal and market reforms risked creating a nation of equal citizens, hence again undermining the privileged status of the party. So turning to this question of status and rule of law, I draw on an extended essay about China's journey towards war by legal scholar Wang Chengguang. By the way, the book, I draw extensively on Chinese authors for my sources for the most part. Critiques of China from within, try to bring them public attention to the Australian community. Wang Chengguang was one of them, I think, quite a remarkable thinker and writer. In a long extended chapter published in 2008, he characterized the country's historic movement toward rule of law as transition from rule by status to rule by contract. That's a classic English, liberal version of transition. Nevertheless, this is how he understood what was happening with the legal reforms undertaken in China. Status referring here to rule by a privileged stratum of people whose privileges are conferred by customary law or their claim on sovereign authority. Contract referring to rule by mutual consent among people of equal standing. This is not just about merchant contracts, commercial contracts. We're talking here about political contracts, which citizens equal. Law reform and market reform complemented each other, in Professor Wang Chengguang's view, in a major historical transition from status to quality, laying a systemic foundation, quote, solid systemic foundation for the development of rule of law, unquote, founded on the principle of equal citizenship. Now, when he took command, the first thing he did, one of the first things, was put an end to this with the arrest of the 300 plus lawyers, stopping in its tracks, sending a message, stopping this transition to an independent judiciary on its tracks, from rule by privileged status to rule among equals. Rule by status is a distinguishing feature, I'd suggest, of Xi Jinping's campaign, reaffirming the stratified status barriers separating cadres from citizens and regimes, such as his own, that separate the leadership from ordinary cadres. This plays out in the economy in a number of ways as well. Yes, what I argue in the book is that if you look at what was happening in China in the reform era, it's very much in the direction of post-communist states in Eastern Europe. But then China's not a post-communist state. It had to stop because it's not. Not being a post-communist state is to re-establish the authority and status of the party over markets, over law, over people, over organised society. And that's what we've been witnessing in the interim. And the party then broke with the practices of the reform era in lending greater weight to politics in its economic interventions, prioritising its own status over every other consideration. In a chapter called Capitalism Without Capitalists, I argue that Xi encroaches on private business and entrepreneurs in ways that don't conform with any known development model, because the logic of CCP nationalism ensures the party is constitutionally incapable of distinguishing national interests from its own, and hence compelled to associate reservation of status with the preservation of national sovereignty or China itself. This is not Marxism, it's CCP nationalism. So what are its international implications?
Good, John. Take another 10 minutes.
10 minutes? All right. Well, moving beyond the book, just to think about the international implications of this way of thinking, we need to start, I think, at the 19th Party Congress in November 2017, when the party leadership announced it would share the party's homegrown solutions to the challenges of equality and popular sovereignty with the world. What's remarkable, it seems to me, worth remarking, is that Xi Jinping's initiatives, the Global Development Initiative, the Global Defense Initiative, Global Security Initiative, Global Belt and Road Initiative, are all premised on the understanding of equality and popular sovereignty. People don't often associate those with nationalism. They are. We're in an age of competing nationalisms organised around how you secure equality and how you exercise popular sovereignty. Now, this is going back to what Xi was saying at the time, universal communism remains the party's ultimate goal, he told the report to Congress, but for the moment, the party aims to project China's solutions abroad along with the values that underpin them. And since then, these have been laid out in a series of initiatives and white papers, stressing the party's achievements in pioneering a new path towards modernisation, promising to bring equality and democracy to the world at large. And using those words, precisely, I think that's worth noting, So one thing common to all the initiatives, the BRI, the GSI, the GCI, the GDI, is that the US and West are not committed to equality. They have an air of superiority and want to impose their system on others. And that's a nationalist claim relating to the importance of status equality and nationalism. So China explicitly proposes to replace that unequal order with a more equal one, the global community of a shared future. Now, this is one of the earliest initiatives until 2013. And if you look at it again, equality runs right throughout. The new order is based on the value of equality and employs practices consistent with that. The terms used are mutuality, dialogue, inclusion. Reading these documents, they're no different from those coming out of the old AusAid or the UN Declaration of Human Rights. But there's something else going on here, and I think we need to focus on that. What is it? I think it's this, that the Communist Party regards nationalism as a regime thing, not a state thing. And it's interested in promoting regime-to-regime relations on the basis of equality, not just state-to-state relations on the basis of equality. And I think that's a finding of an understanding of CCP nationalism in which the party is de facto sovereign, in which it projects that idea onto other parties and states, particularly Russia, but also Iran and North Korea. It's the regime that matters. Now, why do I say this? If we read his Global Security Initiative, which is an elaboration of the one I mentioned already, the Comprehensive National Security Framework, the Zhongting. This is a global application of the domestic. We find it ranks party or regime security alongside national security, understood in the conventional sense. The original domestic Comprehensive National Security Framework, threat assessments, prioritized threats to regime security on the understanding internal and external threats are interlocked, interactive. So, in fact, following the creation of consistent with this Comprehensive National Security Framework, which is domestic, the party has set up a new National Security Council within the party, an NSC within the party, not the state. Just pause and think about that. What's that telling us about where security risks lie, where sovereignty resides? Not in the state and not in anything elected by the people. The new Global Security Initiative takes the domestic vision of regime security to the world. And its mooted appeal, I'd suggest, lies in reassuring authoritarian states that their government's common concerns over regime security are perfectly reasonable. Reasonable is one of the words used in the documents. And will be recognized as legitimate security concern under China's Global Security Initiative. One of the extraordinary things about it is that it basically argues that regime security is a fundamental right of nations that somehow the UN framers neglected to incorporate in the UN Declaration, the framing of the UN. Regime security is a fundamental right of nations. That's my word. Let me explain why I say this. In the Global Security Initiative basically says that equality of security interests, including regime security, need to be taken seriously. Quote, we believe all countries are equal in terms of security interests. The legitimate and reasonable security concerns of all countries should be taken seriously, addressed properly, not persistently ignored or systematically challenged. Now, if we know that reasonable security interests include regime security, and they do in all of China's documents, then any reasonable translation of that is saying that regime security should be recognized as a legitimate national security, should be recognized in global institutions. There's another factor to this I just want to draw to your attention. Party-to-party relations are explicitly elevated in this model, in an international system that recognizes equality among parties. In another speech launching the Global Civilization Initiative in March last year, Xi focused on the role of political parties in development and the need to integrate party building with modernization everywhere. International party-to-party relations enable a people-centered approach quote, the modernisation, which parties are presumed to stand in as the active agents for national peoples, on each party's own warrant. And Xi offered to share Communist Party experience with others to help build a new type of international relations, that's the quote, based on, I quote, a new type of party-to-party relations, end quote, regime to regime. And the party's also very keen to share its model of democracy, which, as we know, is 全国产人民民主 or whole process people's democracy. Xi Jinping's given a number of speeches on this new definition of people's democratic dictatorship, that what the party does is democracy. Basically, it's the processes. Democracy is a matter of processes and procedures. It's about the matrix. It's not about the people. And there's a list of 8 different processes and procedures that constitute Chinese democracy. This is being sold to the world as a practical way of approaching democracy. What the Communist Party does is democracy for China. There is no principle against which it can be measured. There are no values against which it can be measured, other than those of equality and sovereignty, which it claims for itself. So in this competition, we're now in a competition to reclaim equality and democracy for authoritarian states. Xi Jinping argues strengths and weaknesses of national democratic institutions are best tested not against abstract principles, but in heightened international competition among regimes and states for national supremacy, and I quote, today, when the world is undergoing great changes unseen in a century, institutional competition is an important aspect of comprehensive national strength competition. And institutional superiority is an important advantage for a country to win that strategic initiative. That's what he offers. That's what he promises. Institutional superiority, Communist Party's way of doing things to the global south. So if China stays the course, as puts it, as a collectivist nation practicing whole process people's democracy, and persuades others that this is a legitimate security concern of China to maintain this system, and persuade others that's the case, then China will emerge victorious from this international competition over values, over equality and democracy. I can just end there. I'm not quite sure what the policy implications of those remarks are, but I'm sure they may have some. Thank you. Thanks.
You want to sit down for a question? Yes. And are you happy to field your own